All right, let's cut to the chase. The British Broadcasting Corporation, the BBC, the so-called gold standard of global journalism, is in the middle of a complete and total meltdown. We're talking a 5-alarm dumpster fire. The whole thing kicked off over a deceptively edited speech from President Donald Trump, and now the fallout is spiraling into a full-blown catastrophe. We've got top executives hitting the exits, accusations of blatant bias and deliberate manipulation flying left and right, and a looming monster of a lawsuit for a cool $1 billion. This isn't just some minor screw-up, folks. This is a seismic hit to the BBC's credibility, shaking the very foundation of objectivity and fairness they've been preaching about for 100 years. The speed at which this whole mess has unraveled has exposed some deep, systemic rot within the corporation, sparking a bare-knuckle brawl in the public square about the role and responsibility of the media in our hyperpolarized world. The whole disaster traces back to a documentary from their flagship program, Panorama, which aired back in October of 2024, just a week before the US presidential election. This episode, which was supposed to be a deep dive into the political phenomenon of Donald Trump, featured a key clip of his speech from January 6, 2021, given to his supporters in Washington, D.C., right before the chaos at the Capitol. But here's the kicker. That clip was a total fabrication, a slick but fundamentally dishonest piece of editing. The producers took two completely separate parts of the president's speech, spoken nearly an hour apart, and stitched them together to create one seamless, menacing line. In the doctored version, President Trump is made to say, "We're going to walk down to the Capitol, and I'll be there with you. And we fight. We fight like hell." That edit left viewers with only one possible takeaway, that the president was directly inciting his followers to violence, essentially giving them their marching orders to storm the building. In reality, the context was completely different. The first part of that sentence, about walking to the Capitol, was followed by him saying they were going to cheer on our brave senators and congressmen and women. He framed it as a peaceful and patriotic protest, a way to make their voices heard. The part about fighting like hell came almost an hour later, and was in a totally different context, talking about the broader metaphorical fight against alleged corruption and for election integrity. So with a simple, sneaky slice and dice, the entire meaning was twisted. The BBC essentially put words in the president's mouth, making him say something he never actually said in that sequence, or with that intent. To make matters worse, right after this doctored line, the documentary showed footage of people with flags marching determinedly toward the Capitol, creating a direct and false cause and effect narrative. It was a journalistic hit job, plain and simple. The powder keg finally exploded when the British newspaper, The Telegraph, dropped a bombshell exclusive based on a leaked internal BBC memo. The 19-page document was written by Michael Prescott, a respected journalist and a former independent member of the corporation's Editorial Guidelines and Standards Committee. Prescott had resigned his post in June of 2025, protesting the leadership's total inaction. In his detailed report to the board, Prescott laid out numerous instances of journalistic malpractice. He specifically zeroed in on the Trump speech edit, claiming that top brass, including Director General Tim Davie and Head of News Deborah Turness, had repeatedly ignored his warnings and actively defended the breach of standards. It turned out the shady edit was discussed in internal meetings back in January and May, but was swept under the rug each time. The publication of this memo was the spark that lit the fuse on a crisis the corporation could no longer contain. The blowback was immediate and absolutely brutal. Director General Tim Davie, a 20-year veteran of the corporation, and Head of News Deborah Turness both announced their resignations. In his farewell letter, Davie admitted that while the BBC mostly does good work, mistakes were made, and as the man in charge, he had to take ultimate responsibility. Deborah Turness also fell on her sword, but she fiercely rejected the idea that the news division was institutionally biased, calling those claims false. Her exit was marked by an ugly scene outside BBC headquarters, where she was ambushed by reporters grilling her on why the mistakes weren't corrected sooner, and if she felt she had failed the corporation. She kept insisting that BBC journalists are not corrupt, but her words were drowned out by the chorus of condemnation. The reaction from across the pond was, predictably, ferocious. President Donald Trump jumped on the opportunity to go scorched earth. On his social media platform, Truth Social, he celebrated the news, writing that the top people at the BBC, including Tim Davie, the boss, are all quitting, fired, because they were caught doctoring my very good, perfect speech of January 6th. He thanked the Telegraph for exposing the corruption. White House Press Secretary Caroline Leavitt dropped the hammer, calling the BBC a left-wing propaganda machine and a fake news outlet. But it didn't stop with words. The president's legal team sent an official letter to the BBC with an ultimatum. Trump's lawyers demanded a full and fair retraction of the documentary, a public apology, and the removal of the offending material from all platforms by November 14th. If they refused, the corporation was promised a lawsuit to the tune of $1 billion. The letter alleged that the BBC's actions were a deliberate and deceptive attempt to interfere in a U.S. presidential election. In an interview, the president himself said he felt it was his duty to sue to stop people from doing this in the future, stressing that his speech was beautiful and calming, and the edit made it sound radical. Facing a full-scale rebellion and immense public pressure, the BBC leadership was forced to apologize. The new chairman of the BBC board, Samir Shah, who was left to clean up the mess, admitted in a letter to a parliamentary committee that the edit did indeed give the impression of a direct call to action. He called it an error of judgment and offered an apology on behalf of the corporation. Shah also confirmed that the issue had been debated internally long before the leak, but no formal action was taken. This belated apology, however, was too little, too late. It couldn't stop the bleeding. This scandal has ripped the curtain back on a deep, bitter divide, what some insiders are calling a civil war, within the BBC itself. On one side, you have the traditional journalists and editors. On the other, you have political appointees on the board, many with ties to the Conservative Party, who have long been critical of the corporation's perceived liberal bias. This scandal was the perfect ammunition for them to launch an attack and force a change in leadership. The leak of the Prescott memo revealed that the problems went far beyond just their coverage of American politics. The document also detailed concerns about the BBC's reporting on the conflict in the Gaza Strip, migration, and gender identity issues, pointing to a systemic problem. The situation is made 1,000 times worse by the fact that the BBC is a public broadcaster, funded by a mandatory annual license fee paid by every household in the UK. This puts a special responsibility on them to be unimpeachably accurate and impartial. The scandal has torpedoed public trust and handed a massive victory to the BBC's critics, who have long called for radical reform, including scrapping the license fee altogether. The timing couldn't possibly be worse, as this is all happening right before crucial negotiations with the government to renew the Royal Charter, which determines the corporation's future and its funding model. The political firestorm in Britain has also intensified. The leader of the Liberal Democrats, Ed Davey, while acknowledging the need for criticism, condemned Trump's interference in British affairs and called for defending the BBC as a valuable national institution. On the flip side, Nigel Farage, the leader of the Reform UK Party and a longtime Trump ally, declared that the BBC has been institutionally biased for decades and needs a complete overhaul, openly encouraging his audience to switch to rival, right-leaning news channels. Ultimately, this crisis has become one of the most severe tests the BBC has faced in its modern history. It's a stark lesson in how thin the line is between an editorial mistake and a full-blown crisis of confidence that can cripple even a media titan. The departure of two key leaders and the threat of a billion-dollar lawsuit are just the tip of the iceberg. The deeper issues of editorial standards, internal oversight, and political pressure will require a monumental effort from the new leadership to even begin to rebuild trust, both at home and abroad. The future of the BBC as a beacon of public service journalism is now hanging by a thread. This is a watershed moment that will force the corporation to either fundamentally change its ways or continue its slide into irrelevance and public distrust.